Well, I think it's about time for us to get started. Appreciate the presence of each one. We're studying in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 19, and we're down at the riot that takes place. Demetrius's speech against Paul is where we left off in verses 23 through 27, just about finished that paragraph. And then the riot at Ephesus and the things that take place in connection with that. Before we enter into our class, we want to begin with a word of prayer. We'll ask Brother Chuck to direct our minds. Amen. All right, so let's kind of read through the verses leading up to this riot. It says, "And about that time there arose no small disturbance concerning the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but on almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. And not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship should even be dethroned from her magnificence.'" So he is stirring up his fellow tradesmen that make their money off of the worship of the goddess Artemis and that great wonder of the world, that great temple that was there in the city. And he's appealing to their religion and their finances to stir them up against Paul and the gospel. And so we can see how when the gospel is very successful, that oftentimes people of the world are going to fight back against the gospel and its influence, and when they can't win with argument, they will turn to violence, and that's what happens here. These shrine makers, they said, our jobs are going to be held in contempt if this gospel is accepted by people. People will not regard it anymore. We're not going to have any employment. We're going to lose our job, our money. And so they got some motive here to be stirred up. And the temple of Artemis might be made worthless. And he's right. That's exactly what happened. Over time, people heard the gospel and the truth, and these temples all fell into disrepair, and people gave up all of those false gods. Their names just disappeared from people's lives. They were gone. Their temples fell into ruin. So he was right. But the idea of using persecution, that wasn't right. The temple took 220 years to complete. Think about a building that takes that long to build. 377 feet in length, 180 in breadth, 117 pillars of marble, each of them 60 feet high. And he says this great temple is going to fall into ruin if people start accepting the gospel, and it did fall into ruin. It's exactly what happened. The pillars were furnished by different kings and princes from around the world. 36 various carved images on these pillars and so on, all finely polished. We're told by those that have recorded that temple that each of those pillars weighed 150 tons of marble. So gigantic building. It makes the Parthenon, it's like twice as big as the Parthenon that you see in the city of Athens. So much bigger. And you could put 4 temples of Solomon inside that. So that shows you something as magnificent as the Temple of Solomon was. It was only a fourth the size of that temple. And doors and paneling of cypress wood, the roof of cedar. It had all kinds of decorations of gold and fine statues and master paintings that were inside that building. Said all of this is going to fall into ruin. Let's look a little bit at the history of what happened to that temple. Nero robbed it of its art treasures for his golden house in Rome just a few years later after Paul wrote this letter. So Just even some of these secular leaders attacked the temple of Artemis. Of course, that all burned up over there in Rome with the fire that ended up happening. It says Trajan, another emperor, sent its beautifully sculptured doors off to Byzantium for a temple there that eventually turned into one of the big cathedrals and places of worship for Christians in the end. So the ruins were turned into a church building by Justinian. The remains of the temple were burned by the Goths when they invaded the Eastern Roman Empire in 263 AD. So everything he feared was going to happen actually happened. And as we've seen in archaeology, they've got, just nothing left of all of those great pillars. They've re-erected what part of a pillar there. If you went over there to the site of Ephesus today and took a tour of the ruins that are there, really nothing left. So you notice those cultists, the main thing that they were upset about is the money, though. That's where it all started. We're going to lose our money. And when they heard this, they were filled with rage, and they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So they just start chanting and shouting this over and over as he stirred up all of these union members, these guild members of all of these different crafts. And greatly enraged. That was the words, "Great is Artemis," evidently was what they would shout in worship when they had their festivals there. And they kept chanting it over and over and over for Artemis to be exalted, and I guess to call down Artemis's help in defeating Paul in the gospel. And it's just a continuous prayer raised up here with their emotions just given full vent. And this is a tactic still used today, isn't it, by false religions and by politicians to try to get their way, stir up a big mob, get them completely out of control, and go attack your enemies and tear up their property and take their lives and so on. That's what he's doing here. He's using this tactic. And the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So Paul had with him Gaius and Aristarchus in the city. Now, Paul wasn't home at the time the mob showed up. He was somewhere else providentially, and they couldn't get Paul, so they drag off a couple of his companions to take them to the theater before this mob. And you can see the whole city is confusion, and most of the people don't even know what's going on. They just know something big is going on. You just get everybody's out of control and headed to the theater to find out what's going on. Somebody has done something outrageous. And we're going to read about Gaius. He is from Derbe. He's one of those that's going to be carrying the money to Jerusalem for the poor saints. There's also a Gaius of Corinth, and there's a Gaius that John writes to. So 3 or 4 of them in the New Testament. Aristarchus is a man from Thessalonica and one of Paul's fellow laborers. He's mentioned in Philemon 1:24. He traveled with Paul to Rome. He was there with Luke and Paul when they get to Rome in Acts 27:2. He was a prisoner with Paul, and so very faithful man that was continually helping Paul in his ministry. And he may have been sent by the church at Thessalonica, some people think, helped Paul work there in Asia in spreading the gospel to all of those different churches around our cities round about Ephesus. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. And also some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So they have this big theater there. It holds 25,000 people. And they drag Aristarchus and Gaius in there, and they're looking for Paul. And Paul, he wants to go and help his friends and defend himself. So he was not afraid to go down there. He was going to go down to the theater himself. But the other brethren said, "No way should you go down there. These people are out of control. They're looking for blood, right? And so he'd just be killed if he goes there." And some of the Asiarchs, these are men that are leaders there in the city, high government officials of the town. They say, so Paul had friends in high places. It says there he did. I don't know how, they don't seem to be Christians, some of these. It's not mentioned that they were brethren, but Paul had respect even among these Asiarchs that were there, and they threw their weight behind the argument. Don't go down there to the theater. Don't do it. You know, Paul looked back on that when he wrote 2 Corinthians, and he said God saved him from death. Well, how did God save him from death? Through the brethren, through the Asiarchs, convincing him not to go. How does God answer our prayers? A lot of times they're answered through the brethren coming to us and helping us or whatever. That God works through his providence to answer our prayers, and he does through people. They don't even know they're helping God sometimes. They just do. In 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 11, Paul discusses this. It says, for we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia. Well, what was the affliction? What was happening here? That we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Paul had decided, I'm just going to have to die. I'm going to have to go to the theater and try to help this situation. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death, and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope, and he will yet deliver us. You also joining and helping us through your prayers, so that thanks may be given by many persons on our behalf for the favor bestowed upon us through the prayers of many. So Paul said, I counted my life over. I thought I was dead, for sure. But your prayers delivered me. God delivered me. And that's the way Paul looked at it. So what do we do when good fortune happens and we get delivered out of things? I thank God, right, for the prayers of the saints and for my prayers and God's help, right? And it might come through Asiarchs, these men that were appointed. Does anybody else have a thought on these things? I've been talking a lot. Anybody want to add anything? So then, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what cause they had come together. Isn't that sad? We're having a riot. Why are we rioting? I don't know. Everybody else says. We see that kind of stuff now too, don't we? There's people just get caught up in whatever's going on. They really don't know what it's about. But looks like a party, I guess. So confusion is reigning there. Somebody did something and we're upset. So the craftsmen know what it is, and they were shouting through the streets, and now they got everybody else stirred up. So it's a pretty mindless situation. 30 and 31, and some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews put him forward. Having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So one of the Jews, I guess, is wanting to stand up and say, hey, we're not Christians. We're not associated with Paul. Don't blame us for this. We're not out to get rid of your temple or whatever. Even though a lot of these Christians are Jews, the synagogue's not. But he doesn't even get to talk. He just gets shouted down. They kind of lump together the Christians and the Jews evidently together, right? They don't make any distinction. And so his efforts don't do any good. So what do you think would have happened if Paul had gone down there? And he'd have tried to talk to him. They wouldn't have listened to Paul either. So those Asiarchs and the brethren were right. Paul, you don't need to go down there. This is not a situation that's going to work out. You need to just stay out of it. It'll just make things worse if you go down there. So we're given an example of what would have happened. And their response is just to shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, I think about some of these mobs that we used to see back when the Iranians took over the embassy and locked up our people for 44 days it was, and they would shout, "Death to America," or whatever. Same thing over and over. They do these chants to keep the thing all stirred up. Or you think about when Jesus instructs all of us as disciples, he says, when you pray, don't use meaningless repetition. This is exactly what he's talking about. For 2 hours, they say the same thing over and over. Chant this thing. Like that's going to make the difference. If you say it enough times, Artemis is going to do something, right? The prophets of Baal in the contest with Elijah on Mount Carmel, he let them go first. And they went all morning calling out, "Baal, hear us," till they about passed out saying that. And he didn't send down any lightning or do anything. And what did Elijah do? He just went and kneeled down and prayed one time, and God sent down the fire and burned up the sacrifice and the altar and the stones and the water in the ditch. You don't need this meaningless repetition when you pray to God. He knows what you want. You just address him, tell him the things that you need. He's ready to help. You don't have to try to win him over with a chant. But we see this in religion, don't we? That even some forms of Christianity where people will say the same thing. 100 Our Fathers or 100 Hail Marys or whatever, that's going to do something if you say it enough times. No, that was what the pagans did, right? That's not what the Christians do. Verse 35, and after quieting the multitude, here's the town clerk is going to step in and put an end to this. So, again, deliverance arose from the Asiarchs. It came from the brethren not letting Paul go down there, and the town clerk taking over and speaking up. He's going to tell them, hey, you're going to get in trouble with the Romans if you keep acting like this, because the Romans won't put up with this rioting. That's the one thing. The one rule is you don't have a riot under the Roman Empire, or they're going to come down on you. So, and after quieting the multitude, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of Ephesus is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven?" We don't have to shout this all day long and have a riot. Everybody knows her temple's here. That's not in dispute. The town clerk is the same word for clerk there is the word for scribe. That's, when you talk about the scribes and the Pharisees. But here it's in a secular context, not religious. And they had these clerks. They were mediators between the Romans and the city assembly. They kind of go between the two to keep everything in line. And he's drafted official decrees and guarded and tabulated state papers. He kept the citizenship list. He acted as the treasurer of the city. So he was an important individual to listen to when he stands up in the theater and tells them, hey, you got to cut this out. And he it's like the Asiarchs. He doesn't look at Paul with hatred or whatever. So he had some respect for these Roman citizens that were teaching the gospel and weren't doing anything unlawful, right? Why are we having this riot? You don't like the outcome that your position isn't winning the day with people's minds. That's not a reason to have a riot and do violence, is it? Paul hadn't done anything. And notice in this it says the great Artemis, whose image which fell down from heaven. It's thought that, when like a meteorite fell out of heaven, that was like the gods were coming down, or they were sending this object down from somewhere, and they'd build a temple around it, and that was like a sacred site. It's thought this temple of Artemis was there because there'd been some meteorite crash there. Maybe even the image looked sort of like something, a woman or whatever. Maybe that's what they carved the image out of. I don't know. But she said she fell down from heaven there. And they decided that was the sacred, this came from the gods, this temple site. Since then, there is Since then these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. Why are you arguing like this and causing a riot? All of this disorder is useless. We all know about the temple and all. There's no need for all of this rash action and emotion that you're getting carried away with here. And verse 37, for you have brought these men, so here's Gaius and Aristarchus, says, you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So you don't have any right to be mistreating these men, dragging them in here. They didn't rob the temple. Now Nero's going to do that, but these men didn't do it. They hadn't robbed the temple. Now that might be something to have an outrage over if that had happened. It says they're not blasphemers. They haven't went around. Paul says gods that are made with hands are no gods at all. That doesn't sound like somebody that's out just slandering and ridiculing other people. That's not what he was doing. He was just teaching the basic facts of religion, that God is not in the image of one of these things. You don't make idols. So again, they weren't guilty of doing any of these things that should have caused a riot, and no reproachful language was used. And again, what did they do? They reasoned against these things. They did miracles to show God backed up their message of the gospel. Paul pointed to his hearers and asked them to choose a better way, right? He didn't force anybody to do anything. We don't. We try to persuade people by the word of God. But we don't use ridicule or force or a riot to try to get people to follow our religion. And certainly force shouldn't be used against us. And the riot was just unjustifiable. They ought to let these men go. They hadn't done anything wrong. 38 and 39, so then if Demetrius, he's recognized as the leader of all of this, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available, and let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. Well, this is what a reasonable, orderly government does, isn't it? If you got a complaint, we've got courts. You can go to court, and if somebody's wronged you, you can bring charges there, and these things can be handled in a lawful way. Shouldn't that be what is said if there's any kind of riot today, where people are burning things down and practicing violence? It should be the government cracks down on that just like the Romans would do. Say, no, you can't do that. We have courts. You've got ways to, without violence, to settle things. You don't have to turn to violence and disorder. And, we've got a lot of our system of government has been handed down from these ancient people like this, that they had courts of law to handle disputes. That's the reason we have courts. We don't take things into our own hands and have mob violence, yes. And I think he probably knew that you're trying to feed this mob. That's why you're doing it, right? And you know good and well that the assembly meets, the judges meet several times a week. If you got something against Paul, take it to the court. You don't take the law into your own hands. Ever since God established civil government, He's taken revenge. He's taken vengeance out of our hands, right? The government takes care of that. They're God's servants to deal with that. And of course, we need to teach our children, don't we? You don't, crack somebody over the head with whatever. You go to the teacher. You go to your mother. You go to your father. You go to somebody. You don't take the law into your own hands to decide what you're going to do. And of course, we're to understand that, and these men should have known that too. One other thing to point out in this context, we often talk about the word church or ecclesia. A lawful assembly is the word ecclesia right there. It's the same word. So you can see the word ecclesia, the called out. It can be used in a secular sense, a lawful assembly, the assembly of the citizens there in town. Or it can be used about God's assembly that he's called out, right? Yes, Chuck, you got a thought? And I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And Solomon, he talked about the same things in the book of Ecclesiastes, that you look for justice and you don't find it, right? Under the sun. Sometimes that's the way it is, but you've got to trust God, and he raises up governments and brings them down, and we keep doing what we're supposed to do, and God will take care of what needs to be taken care of, and you just have to stay faithful. Now, we have people we can turn to, and sometimes they won't do their job, and that's really bad. I mean, you might have a town clerk that wouldn't have done his job, but this guy did, and we're thankful for that, for Paul's sake. Yes. Right. Well, absolutely. We have to, trust the Lord, and as a rule, things do swing. We have a lot of persecutions in the early church, but they didn't last long, and the wheel turns. So you just keep being faithful and hang in there, and things usually turn around. Yeah. Right. Today we got brethren in every kind of system there you can think of. They're under around the world today, and they're needing to be faithful wherever they're at. They're faithful to the Lord. All right. Says, for indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's affairs, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection we shall be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. And after saying this, he dismissed the assembly. So he says, let me tell you, you're in trouble here. If you don't settle down and leave, the Romans are going to hear about this. We're a free city. The Romans could take all those freedoms away from us for a riot. So you'd better shut this thing down, because there's no real cause for this. And then he dismisses it like that was an orderly assembly. I guess that kind of puts the best ending on it he could. It's like, okay, and now we're dismissed from this. Like you could tell the Romans, well, wasn't that out of control? We had some order at the end anyway, right? So, yes. That's right. Go home. So that ends this. We'll look at Paul's journeys on into Macedonia and Achaia next time.